This is Doug DeMuro, and today I'm going to discuss where all of my old cars have ended up. I bought my first car 20 years ago. I CarFax all of my old cars usually once a year or so, and since I've been selling a few cars lately, I thought it might be fun to go and check and see what happened to them all. So I just CarFaxed them all again, and I can give you some updates about where they've gone. Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Okay, so here is what has happened to all of my old cars. I have now owned 37 different cars, and I am not gonna go through them all. I'm just gonna hit on the ones you remember if you've been watching my channel for a while, plus some of the ones that have crazier stories after I sold them, and there are some interesting stories, plus some of the ones that meant the most to me. And I'll start there with my very first car, which was a 1996 Volvo 850 Turbo. I owned this car as a high school student in Denver from September of '04 to September of '06. This car had a ton of problems, a ton of issues during the period I owned it, and my parents, once I finished with it, they sold it to some people in northern Colorado, and amazingly, those people kept the car on the road for another 12 years, all the way through 2018, which blew me away. We had so much trouble keeping it on the road as a 10-year-old used car. But eventually it got a junk title in 2018. So my first car is junked and off the road, and there are probably parts of it in some junkyard in northern Colorado somewhere. My second car was a 2001 Audi A4, and this is probably more important to me than my first car. It was the car I had when I met my wife. It got me through college. It got me to my first job. There's a lot of emotion tied up in that car. I had it from 2007 to 2010, and I got rid of it because the Tiptronic automatic transmission died. It failed, which was a common failure point in all Audi models from that era. To be fair, it failed at like 130, 140,000 miles. It had a good life, but it was dead. And so the dealership where I was trading it in on my next car, which was a Mark V GTI, they offered me $500 for it, just basically like, hey, it's a dead transmission. A mechanic at the dealer offered me $600, so I sold it to him instead. And this is where it surprises me. He fixed it and sold it off, I assume, and it has bounced around to Texas and then California, and it had its last CarFax event last year in Winter Garden, Florida. It is still on the road. My old Audi A4 from college 15 years ago. B5 A4 Audis are not common to see anymore, so this is pretty surprising. But the Audi 2.8 liter V6 is a very reliable engine, and once the transmission was replaced, you got a long time, or maybe swapped with a stick, you got a long time to go, so it's probably pretty good. I don't know the current mileage, but in 19 it had 231,000 miles, and it is dark red Audi A4 in Winter Garden, Florida. Maybe you've seen it. So, some other interesting cars from my pre-YouTube days that have some stories that are worth telling. Number one, I owned an E36 BMW M3 sedan. It is the only BMW I've ever owned. It was a nice car. It was white with a gray interior, manual transmission, an M345. I had the car for about 6 months in 2010 or 11 before I sold it to a firefighter in Indiana. And a year later, he crashed it. But it was issued a rebuilt title in Ohio, and it stayed on the road, and as of January of 21, it's back in Atlanta where I owned it. This is a theme, by the way, we'll come back to, cars returning to Atlanta where I owned them. But it still has a rebuilt title in Georgia, but it is still on the road in Atlanta, and I am so curious what it looks like now, where it is, where it ended up. I have Googled the VIN to see if it sold online, because a lot of E36 M3s sell online. One of the auction sites, Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, it has never come up anywhere. And I am so curious to see what happened to it, where it is, what's it like now. And of course, it's funny to see it back in Atlanta where I had it. And again, that has happened to several of my cars. But the best example is my 2007 Mercedes E63 AMG Wagon. I owned this car for a year, basically all of 2012. And I had it in Atlanta, where I lived at the time, and I sold it to a fellow Doug in Texas, another guy named Doug. He bought it in the end of 2012, and he kept it for 5 years, and in 2017, he sold it to someone else in Atlanta. So it returned to where I lived when I had it. But here's the crazy part. A few years later, 2020 or 21, I'm walking down the street in Atlanta. I visited to go see friends and to kind of go back to my old haunts for a week or whatever. And I'm walking down the street in my favorite neighborhood on the planet, which is Inman Park in Atlanta. And guess what I see on the road? My old E63 AMG Wagon, the very car that I own, down to the VIN. I mean, the same exact car. Not only did it get sold back to where I owned it, but I literally happened to see it randomly when I was walking down the street 8 years after I sold it. And the really amazing thing is the person who bought it from the Doug that I sold it to only lives a few blocks away from where I lived in Atlanta when I had the car. So it was in this spot in Atlanta, and then I sold it to a guy in Texas who had it for 5 years, and then it came right back to where it was, and I happened to encounter it walking down the street. And the other coincidence is I don't even know who the new owner is. I have no clue. I don't know if they know it was my old car. I have no idea about any of that stuff. It's not like I coordinate it with them. I just happened to walk down the street and see it blocks from where I used to live. Crazy story. Another great story, 2001 Mercedes E55 AMG that I had. I owned this car for most of 2011 and I truly loved it. And this is probably the car that I regret selling the most. And I sold it to an attorney in Atlanta. I especially wish I hadn't sold it because it was just so nice. It was low mileage. It's hard to find a 210 E55 that has low mileage now. And it was a really nice car. And it was in amazingly good shape. And you'd have to pay a lot for that car today. So I've always known that the attorney who I sold it to kept it. And amazingly, he has been daily driving it since I sold it to him in the parking lot of the German car repair shop where he had a PPI done. I remember signing the papers 13 years ago. He's still daily driving it today. He bought it from me with super low miles, like 50,000 miles. But since he's been dailying it, his last renewal was 154,000 miles. And I've always wondered about this car because I kind of view it as the one that got away. And I think about it from time to time. And so a couple months ago, I actually went down a rabbit hole and I found the guy's name from the email correspondence and I Googled around and looked him up and I found where he lives in Atlanta and I went to his house on Street View and there's like 4 W210 Mercedes E-Class models at his house. And I thought, you know what? This guy deserves this thing. He obviously is an enthusiast of these cars and I'm glad he has it and I'm glad he's still daily driving it all these years later. That's probably the one that I miss the most, or maybe the only car I've ever sold that I really miss. The other really interesting story of a car that I owned and sold, I briefly had a 2002 Mercedes-Benz G500. That was the first year that Mercedes-Benz officially brought them to the United States. I had it like late 2011, early 2012, and then I discovered that it was really rusty, so I pawned it off on CarMax, who then sold it to auction, a wholesale auction to some dealer, and eventually it landed in Florida. And the story on this one is that the person who bought it eventually, allegedly, used it to hit and run and kill 2 pedestrians. And there's actually security footage from when it happened showing the G-Wagon not hitting the people, but driving away with damage to its front end. The police tracked it down because the G-Wagon is pretty rare, those early G-Wagon models, and it had a very distinctive specialty Florida license plate. And they were able to track it down and they found the guy. And they arrested him and charged him with DUI and with vehicular homicide, whatever. And the case dragged on for years and years, and eventually he was acquitted because the police couldn't prove that he was drunk at the time, since they arrested him days later, and they couldn't prove that he even knew that he had hit people. That was his argument, that I thought I didn't know what I hit and I just drove on. Regardless of the facts of the case, obviously a crazy story about that car. The police had it in their impound for years after they arrested the guy and as the case dragged on. But eventually, once the case was over, the car sold at an auto auction. I don't know if the police had taken possession at that time or if the guy got it back, but it sold at an auto auction pretty quickly after the case ended. And now it's in McLean, Virginia, right outside DC. And I bet the current owner has no idea that it killed people, but that is a crazy kind of dark story. So the rest of the cars that I had owned, some other interesting pre-YouTube ones. I had a Lotus Elise that for a while was in Abilene, Texas with over 80,000 miles, bright orange. Apparently has now moved to California's Central Coast. I also had an Aston Martin V8 Vantage. I did make videos with that one. I drove it all the way across the country, did meetups with it. I sold it to Tavares, Freddie, the YouTuber in Florida. He eventually sold that car. It also found its way back to Atlanta, and then he bought it back, and I think he still owns it. There was a period where I briefly had a 2011 2011 Cadillac CTS-V Wagon. I had that through most of 13, and it was my very first YouTube video. I sold that car to a guy in Texas December of 13, and he later fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into a tree and totaled it just a month after he bought it from me. So that car is gone. It was destroyed. The guy was okay, but that was an automatic transmission car, so don't worry. Since I started YouTube, some of the cars that I've gotten rid of, people are asking about, what happened to this, what happened to that. My CarMax Range Rover is probably the most famous car associated with me. I owned it for 7 years. The CarMax warranty lasted for 6 years, and I got 35 grand in CarMax repairs out of it. And eventually, it had 130 or 140,000 miles. It was getting old. I didn't want it anymore. And I gave it to a friend of mine who lives on Nantucket, where I spend some time in the summer. And so he still has it, actually. I don't think it's getting repaired quite at the level that it was when CarMax was paying for everything, but he still owns the car, and I see it periodically when I'm on Nantucket, my old famous Range Rover, now no longer mine and long gone, but it did have a big place in my history. I had a Ferrari 360. That was the car that I really started doing YouTube videos with. I had it for all of 14, and I did a lot of videos with it. That's how a lot of people found my channel. I sold it in 14 to a guy in Northern California, and he still has it 10 years later. It was a manual 360, and he bought it for like 83 grand, and I think he's done pretty well financially on it. I had a Hummer. You probably remember the Hummer if you were watching my videos a while ago. I sold that in late 2015 when I was done making videos with it to a guy in New Hampshire. He also still has it. 9 years later, he's driving that Hummer. One sadness that I have is my R32 Nissan Skyline and my Nissan S Cargo. I have lost touch with those cars because they don't have 17-digit VINs. And so you can't look them up on CarFax. So my Skyline, I sold it to a guy in Kansas. I do not know. That was 10 years ago. I do not know if he still has it. My S Cargo, which I loved dearly and was ridiculous, I sold that to a guy in Kansas who ran a pizza place. He eventually sold it on to a guy in Pennsylvania who used it for like a political campaign because it was so ridiculous. He put his campaign stuff on the side. He actually sold that on Cars and Bids to the political campaign guy. But the campaign, that was years ago. The campaign's obviously over. I don't know if he still has that car. It's a shame. The Dodge Viper that I had, people are often asking me about that. I sold it in 2017 to a guy in New Jersey 7 years ago. He still has it. All these people kept my cars. The 2012 Mercedes E63 AMG Wagon. This is an important car because it was the very first car auctioned on Cars and Bids, my AMG Wagon. I sold it to a guy in Maryland, the guy who won the auction, and he had it for, I guess, like 4 years, and he just resold it, also on Cars and Bids. So I'll be interested to see where that ended up going. My Audi RS2 that I had and I loved, I sold that on Cars and Bids a couple of years ago to a guy in Indiana. My new green Land Rover Defender, that one went to a guy in Arizona. And my Kia Stinger that I had also on Cars and Bids, that went to someone in Wisconsin. The most interesting ones are the newest ones that I have just sold on Cars and Bids. My Toyota Land Cruiser that I had for a couple of years on the East Coast, that stayed local here in Southern California. It went to a car enthusiast in Orange County, only about an hour away. He took an Uber from Orange County down here to San Diego to pick it up. He told me he also has an M4 GTS, so he is an enthusiast, and now he has my old Land Cruiser. My old Land Rover Defender, my yellow Defender that I had for 7 years and truly loved, that car went to Lake George, New York, upstate New York, where it joins a fantastic garage that includes an Aston Martin Virage, a Saab 9.5, the new Saab 9.5, and a Lotus Esprit. It is the perfect place for it. I'm sad it's gone, but it's with a wonderful guy who's going to love it and take care of it, and a wonderful eclectic mix of cars that it will share its garage with. So there you go. I've had 37 cars, and I still own 6. But that's what's happened to all of my old ones, including a few that I recently sold that you might be curious what happened to them. If you live in one of the places where my old cars is that I mentioned, if you see that white E36 M3 in Atlanta, send me an email, send me a picture. I want to see what happened to these things. A few of these cars are still with the people I sold them to, so I could, in theory, keep tabs on them. But most of them have gone to a second or a third or a fourth owner, and I don't know where they are anymore. I don't know who's driving them, what they look like, and I would be kind of curious to see. So if you happen to see that orange Elise in Abilene, Texas, shoot me a picture. But there you go. That's the story of what happened to my cars.